Welcome, friend. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, and weird history. Today, we have a wonderful combination of women's history and an author interview. I am so excited to be joined today by Julia Kelly. She is an award-winning author who has written several historical novels about ordinary women in extraordinary circumstances, which we love. And she's also an Emmy-nominated producer and journalist. And we're just so lucky to have her today. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Julia.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted.
It's great. We had some scheduling issues on my part, but we're finally here today. We're ready to go. And I'm so happy to have you on and talk about your wonderful book, The Dressmakers of London. But before we dive into the book, let's get to know our guest first. So Julia Kelly.
I answered to all names. It's all good.
How did you get started with your journey of writing historical fictions? How did that all happen?
Well, if we go way back, I've been scribbling stories for as long as I can remember. And my mother would tell you, absolutely, I was writing little bits and pieces in notebooks, ever since I was a kid. I decided at some point I wanted to try to write a book. I was in graduate school. I was probably what we would now call burned out, but we really didn't talk about that at that time. So I just knew I needed to do something that wasn't my graduate work. And so I was a big reader of romance novels. And so I actually decided to write a romance novel at the time. And I did that for a while. It took me a while to get published. And then I wrote a number of romance novels set in Victorian England. And then I decided actually to pivot into writing historical fiction, but keeping a real focus on women's history and sort of the more forgotten or lesser known aspects of women's history. And so I was living in London at the time. I had moved over from New York. It all felt very new and very exciting. And I was walking around the city and was seeing all these memorials, war memorials, which in particular parts of London you do run across a lot. And I was starting to see ones dedicated towards women, and I became interested in what women were doing during the war, not just on the home front, sort of keeping, as the cliche goes, the home fires burning, but also actively in service. So I wrote a book called The Light Over London, and that was about a woman who goes into the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS, and actually ends up working on the anti-aircraft guns that were keeping areas like London safe from air attack. And that sort of started this, I suppose, love affair with women's history from World War II. And so I've written kind of all across different areas of World War II, different timelines, different, occupations for women, telling different stories. I've written some things that aren't World War II as well. Dressmakers of London, this is the first time I've written about sort of the middle of the war. And in this particular book, the focus is really on clothing rationing, which is something I find absolutely fascinating. I love clothes. I love fashion history, both very good things. And so I wanted to sort of indulge my interest and write about basically fashion on the ration.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the perfect place for that because we love weird niche topics like fashion rationing in World War II, things that you wouldn't really think about. So that's a fascinating journey. And that kind of leads us directly into what your book, The Dressmakers of London, is about. Could you give us just a brief, overarching, like Cliff Notes version of the book?
So authors are notoriously bad at summarizing their own books, so I'm going to do my best here. So basically, I've written a book where two sisters who are estranged inherit their mother's dress shop. Surprisingly, one of the sisters who's worked there for a very long time expects to be the sole owner. It turns out that her sister, who left the family a long time ago and has sort of married up in the social order, inherits as well. So there's this estrangement, and these sisters are forced back together again. And it looks as though, the I suppose you would say, more well-off sister, Sylvia, is going to sell to her dressmaking sister, Izzy, except Izzy gets conscripted. It's 1941, the end of 1941. Conscription for women is announced, and Izzy falls within the group of women who are being told, okay, you're going to have to serve in either, one of the military auxiliary branches, or there were different ways that women could do essentially their war service. And so Izzy is forced to ask Sylvia to basically mind the shop for her. And in the process of that, they start writing letters back and forth to one another while Izzy is at her training, and Sylvia is sort of trying to pull together what is a struggling dress shop in the midst of clothing rationing. And through that, they start to examine what it is that hold them apart, who they are now, how they might find it in themselves to reconcile, and also save this struggling dress shop.
Yeah, one thing I really love about the Dressmakers of London is how it's both very historical, but also very personal and emotional. So how do you kind of balance that line of making something emotional, but also keeping it historical at the same time?
I'm so glad you've asked. I've never been asked this question before, but it's something I've thought a lot about, because I don't know if I'm always the most sort of emotionally immediate writer. I sort of don't just pour emotion onto the page. So I have to kind of think about I try to start from a place of always telling stories about characters. So the plot comes from the characters. And I think that really helps. So, when it starts with, you have this estrangement between two sisters, you have Sylvia and Izzy, and they're on different sides of this rift. What is it that's driving that rift? And what is it that do they have regrets about that? How did they get to this point? And then, because I knew that I wanted to have a reconciliation as part of this book, what would they have to do, and how would they have to change and grow as characters in order to get to that point? And I think that is the heart of the emotion in the book. And that's where everything is coming from, because, I'm very aware, having seen people go through this, that estrangements or no contact, as people talk about it today, is not something that's entered in lightly. I think even, people are making the decision because they're trying to put boundaries around a toxic relationship. It is something that can be very difficult, very painful, and very emotional. So I wanted to make sure that I was giving proper thought and attention to why somebody might, start to navigate out of this difficulty with a sister. I am a sister. I love my sister very much. We're very close. And so I think one of my starting points, and maybe one of the ways of accessing that emotion, because again, I'm not sort of just a open up the laptop and everything is out on the page, all the emotions fully formed type of author. One of the ways that I kind of thought about that is, what if we had this estrangement? What if something had happened? What would that feel like? And what would that look like? Having that as a starting point, my poor sister, having this as a starting point really helped sort of give some context to that. And then when it comes to the historical part and marrying that up, you also have the really interesting, I think, the very interesting circumstance of, times of great conflict like World War II, they create sort of natural moments of friction in society. So you have things like the opening up of opportunities for women outside of the home to do things and to be in traditionally male-dominated industries. And we know, if you're interested in history, it doesn't always stay that way. And there was a retraction when the war ended, and men wanted their jobs back and wanted things to be the way that they were. There is an element of, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, but society takes some time to sort of readjust and figure out what the new reality is. And so I've always been interested in those moments of conflict in history where there's opportunity for, changes in dynamics between the traditional gender roles, or also class. I'm very interested in class because but also, being a British citizen living here in the UK, the class system is both very similar and very different in interesting ways. And I think sometimes people make the mistake of thinking there's no class system in the US, and that couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah. Yes.
The class system looks different, and how it's structured and the signifiers. And one of the things that was interesting as a dual national, but really an American expat coming and living here, was I didn't have as many of those signifiers as I thought I did. And so I've sort of always since coming here and been interested in why historically have those things been in place? What are they? What makes them recognizable to us today? And so hopefully you throw all of that together and you weave all of that in, and you get a book.
Yeah, yes. And a book you did get, and it's a fabulous book, and in my personal opinion. So I'd love to focus a little bit more on those historical conflicts. So we see the conflict between the two sisters, but what are some other conflicts that women of this time face? I mean, during the Blitz and being enlisted and things like that.
Absolutely. So you have a huge amount of change going on all, during this period of time. So the book is really set between about November 1941 and June of 1942. And if you think about that time period, you have had the Blitz in 1940 to 1941. So bombing has very much been present and literally changing the physical landscape of London, let alone, the deaths and casualties that arose from that. So you have London itself is changing, and there's this threat of course, being bombed. Then you also have the conscription of women. So you had unmarried and married women actually who didn't have dependents, so no children, no caring for the elderly, were called up. So you have this huge societal shift. A lot of men had been called up to war. A lot of people were already doing things for the war effort, but this is a different level of requiring, women to show up in these roles. So women could have, served in the auxiliary forces of the military, so non-combat roles, although they absolutely were still in danger. Depending on their role, it could be really harrowing what they were doing. In this case, Izzy ends up becoming a member of a barrage balloon unit. So these were the huge, they look like sort of like blimps to me, that were raised, and they were meant to be defensive measures to prevent the Luftwaffe planes from being able to fly low enough to bomb accurately. So they were placed in areas of strategic importance to protect either cities or, armament factories, things like that. And then on top of that, you also have the fact that Britain feels very alone in the war at the start of this book. 1941 is a difficult year. It's becoming obvious that, France is occupied, things are going badly, and they desperately want the Americans to join. And then, of course, we do have the Americans joining the war with Pearl Harbor. So there's huge amounts of change going on. A lot of upheaval in society. People are dealing with the war as a, day to day, it's just part of their daily life. There's no escaping it. And so that's the kind of setting in which this book ends up unfolding.
Yeah, yeah. And at the beginning, we were talking about the backdrop for this book is the fashion rationing. So what kind of fashion rationing was going on at this time, and what drew you to that particular type of rationing or that particular instance in World War II?
Yeah, so this is where I like to get really, really nerdy. So stop me.
I love it. No.
This is great. So I've always known about rationing because it's sort of something that culturally bubbles up here and people talk about it, right? So food rationing came into place in 1940, and it meant that you had ration books that were issued to you. You had coupons that you would tear out and you'd exchange, when you went to pay for something. It was to more evenly distribute food and also to preserve, the amount of food available to the British public. There was a real concern about the ability to feed people because of all of the conflicts going on, because of, ships being attacked, things like that. So getting food into the country was problematic. So what Britain could actually produce was really, really important, and making sure that was still able to be distributed. Same thing with clothing rationing. So the clothing ration starts in June 1st, 1941, and the Board of Trade is the organization that actually governs it. And the reasoning, there are a few reasons behind putting rationing into place. One is to preserve the labor and the raw materials needed to create clothing. A lot of that was being diverted into things like creating uniforms. Silk was used for parachutes, so silk was unavailable as a material to be used in kind of commercial clothing. And the idea also was that if you started the war with a large wardrobe and you were a well-off person, you might have a lot of clothing that you could fall back on if rationing came into place. If you were less well off, if you were on the poverty line, in any way struggling, you wouldn't have as much in terms of resources. And so the idea was to prevent people from not having to prevent people from having no access to clothing, new clothing, and also to improve the quality of clothing as well. And it's interesting, food rationing also does that. The quality of some people's diets actually improves on the ration, people believe. But anyway, so basically rationing comes in, and initially the government says use your margarine coupons from your ration books, but eventually they actually issue a ration book for people specifically for clothes. And it meant that you had a certain number of tickets that could be exchanged for items. So for instance, in 1942, when it first really starts to get standardized, I believe a dress was 11 coupons, which well, you have to pay your money and you pay your fine. Except when you think about it, initially people are working with 66 coupons for the entire year, which I think, in this era of fast fashion. So this made me think so much about sort of my own wardrobe and how I buy and what I buy and how wardrobe is and all of that. So I went through many levels of sort of existential crisis. I do love clothes, but the idea that over the course of a year, you're going to have 66 coupons, and stockings are going to cost you 2 coupons. A dress is 11. A coat might be 17 coupons. And so if you think about it, Britain has seasons. And so if you're buying a summer dress, maybe that means you're not able to then buy that winter coat that you need because yours is falling apart or you've grown out of it or whatever it is. And so it makes people really sit and think about what it is that they're going to buy. There's a big campaign to make do and mend, repair clothing, make sure that it in some ways echoes very much the sort of sustainability conversation that's being happened. Do more with your clothes. Clothes absolutely were generally of a higher quality than today, so they might be more easily, repaired and might last a lot longer. But that is really restrictive, 66 coupons. And then throughout the war, it actually becomes less and less and less until 1945, I believe only 25 coupons. And rationing continues until 1949, so well after the war is done. So this is something that affects people's daily lives and absolutely has an impact on, how you're thinking about your own wardrobe, maybe your family's wardrobe. If you had children, it just, because we put on clothes every day and go out into the world in them, it's something that suddenly becomes a big point of focus. And that's one of the things I think is so interesting about fashion history is clothing is an everyday part of our lives. And it can have a huge impact on how we feel about ourselves, how we look. It was a huge point of morale in the UK. There's famous stories about women not being able to get silk stockings anymore or stockings at all. Nylons this really, important thing. And so women were drawing, the seams of their stockings on the back of their legs with eyebrow pencils and, coal and things like that. And I just think it's so interesting because it's how you present yourself to the world. And it's this little detail of history, but it has such an impact on people's daily lives.
Yeah. Are there any other examples of how, the showing of femininity changed during World War II because of these rations, because of these things that couldn't be accessed anymore? Did that change what femininity was in London in World War II?
Yeah, I think it does. You have the classic examples of, the idea that to make yourself up is a form of patriotism. So, red lipstick very much was, in vogue. And there were some lipstick makers that made sort of like Liberty Red and things like that. And I think in some ways that's a direct response to Hitler, who very much apparently was interested in natural women and women who weren't wearing makeup. So it's a direct, it's kind of a direct screw you in a lot of ways to that philosophy. But I think in terms of, how fashion looks, you also get a lot of changes. So if you think about the 1930s, and when I think about the 1930s, I am a bit guilty sometimes of thinking very much of the Hollywood version, which is the most glamorous, most extreme. But go with me here for a second. Lots of floor-length bias cut gowns, silk, lots of really sumptuous fabric is what comes to mind. And then, of course, if you don't have access to silk anymore because it's not legal to buy and sell clothing with it, what do you do? And so you see a lot of changes come into place, and one of the reasons is the Board of Trade issues something called the Civilian Clothing Order in 1942, which actually becomes a plot point in the book. So I was able to kind of pivot around some history, where basically they say, okay, not only are you having to buy your clothing with tickets and these coupons, you're also having to restrict what it is that you can buy. So dressmakers, clothing manufacturers, department stores can only sell items with certain attributes. So for instance, you could have 4 knife pleats in a skirt or 2 inverted box pleats in a skirt. And so immediately, anything that deviates from that means it becomes not legal to buy or sell. Double-breasted jackets were out the window. It was single-breasted only. You couldn't have cloth-covered buttons. It just becomes, it basically starts to dictate what clothing looks like. And so that silhouette that you think of when you think of wartime fashion, kind of military-like jackets become very popular, but that silhouette is always single-breasted. It's always a long lapel with not too many buttons on the front. And so all of this is because they're trying to save cloth. They're trying to, restrict what people can wear, to standardize it, to the point where there's actually a program called the Utility Scheme. And that was sometimes hated, sometimes loved, depending on who it is that you ask. Standardize some of the clothing that people actually could wear and could buy. So it became possible to buy, a utility blouse in 12 different colors and 10 different patterns, but it was all the standardized blouse to kind of cut down on waste and make it possible to distribute clothing more evenly to the population in general.
So interesting. That's so fascinating. And I think you do a really fantastic job of, through your storytelling, showing the fashion of the time. There were several moments in the story where I was like, I don't know what this is. What kind of jacket is this? What kind of button is this? And it's so fascinating to see all of the different fashion vocabulary woven into this story. So I'd love to ask you, what was research like for that aspect of the book? Did you already have this knowledge? Did you have to seek it out?
I've always had interest in this. And so I think it helps sort of naturally being interested in clothes and being interested in kind of vintage fashion. But I had, about a year before starting to write this book, become interested in sewing and trying to dress make myself. So I've been a lifelong knitter. I knit, I think, very well, and garments that I wear out in the world, and I don't think you can sit there and be like, it's a woman wearing a handmade sweater. If you do notice it, hopefully it's for a good reason. But dressmaking is just a completely different skill, and so I come from a family on both sides. My paternal grandmother was a great quilter and also made all of, my dad remembers her making the family's clothing. My maternal grandmother actually was a dressmaker and owned a dress shop, which unfortunately I never went to. But my cousins on that side as well, 2 of my cousins are very talented seamstresses who have worked for, the English National Opera and the Royal Ballet and all sorts of organizations like that. And so very high level. I've always known how to sew. My mother taught me. My mother also taught me how to knit. And so I started sewing after watching a lot of great British Sewing Bee and things like that. And
I love that show.
It's so great. It's the most relaxing, stressful show.
Truly.
It really is. I want Esme and Patrick Grant to sort of come in and very kindly, witheringly tell me something doesn't work.
Right.
Exactly. So, but that was what it was like. Basically, my sister had started to learn how to sew about a year before I did. And so I had a bit of her knowledge. And so I got myself set up with a sewing machine and realized how difficult it is to produce a wearable, good garment. I have so much admiration for people who sew and sew really proficiently, because it is a completely different language. And so, the historical research is really important. And it's vital, but in some ways, sewing and sewing badly or sewing not very well. I've made some things that are actually wearable, but not that many for how long I've been trying. And so, it's really a skill, and it's a skill that I think, I've always been interested, because I think of knitting and my connection to that craft. I've always been interested in these sort of, you could argue, traditionally female crafts, although there's a great history of male knitters. There is a great history male, sewers and tailors, of course. But these sort of crafts that I think don't get as much attention and admiration as I think they should, they require so much skill, and to do it well and to do it to a level where you could commercially sell garments, to clients as they do in a dress shop, custom garments that are designed for you, that are fitted for you, that are completely unique. I just have so much admiration for it. So a lot of it was me sitting there thinking about me, running things up on my little singer in my flat in London, trying to desperately figure out how to make this seam work, and trying to translate some of that to, okay, if I actually did this well, what would that look like? What would I be concerned about? What would I be interested in, when I'm trying to adapt my business to all the changes that are happening during World War II?
Yeah, and a lot of changes needed to happen, especially I feel like to a women's catering dress shop, because the materials are rationed, the fashion is rationed. So there's so many restraints and restrictions that you have to follow as a dressmaker during that time. And I think you really did a beautiful job explaining that and portraying that in your story. So that was excellent. Another thing that I really loved about the Dressmakers of London is how letters play a huge role in this book, and how important the letters were for wartime communication. So I would love to know why you decided to include that, and if there are any, anecdotes that you have, historical anecdotes about letters during World War II.
Well, I think part of the answer is it was just practical. So, if I have one sister who's in London working at the dress shop, and I have one sister who's out in training camps, and then eventually she ends up in Norfolk with her barrage balloon unit actively, as part of her service, you can't pick up the telephone really easily, and you can't physically show up really easily because, if Izzy needs to be in Norfolk and Sylvia needs to be in London, they're not going to be, doing a lot of back and forth. So letters became a real vehicle to make sure there was still communication. Again, as one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is look at how these sisters could reconcile and figure out, who they are now and what that means for their relationship as they come back together again. And so I felt like letters were really the only pathway I could take. But in a way, I was so happy that that was the case, because I think letters are very personal, very intimate. And I think in a lot of cases, they allow us to say something that you wouldn't necessarily be ready to say or know how to say in person. You can stop, you can process, you can think, and you can really craft a letter. And so there's also some time delay between them. So, if you send a letter and your letter crosses with somebody else, maybe you've said one thing, they've said another thing, and it can create conflict as well within a story. Yeah. So, that was really helpful in that regard. I also I love epistolary novels, and this is not a pure epistolary novel, but it has, definitely that side to it. And so being able to play around with that as a writer was interesting. It is hard writing letters. I'm old enough that I can remember writing letters. It's a skill I just don't use anymore. So it took me a few full starts to really get back into the mode of writing them. Yeah. And to also remember that as an author, it's not a journal entry. It's not a diary. So you're not rehash everything you've just read on the page previously. What you're trying to do is enhance what your character's either revealing something, or they're, sharing information, or they're hiding something from somebody and sort of telling a half truth and reporting something differently than actually happened in real life, and sort of remembering to use that as a sort of a trick and a vehicle as an author was great. But it is hard writing letters. I need to do it more often because it really is a dying skill, unfortunately.
Yes. Well, I am a very avid letter writer. In fact, this is my whole...
I'm so impressed.
I'm a lover of snail mail, and I write letters all the time. In fact, I will be sending you a letter as thank you after. I always send my guests a behind the scenes. I send a thank you letter to all the guests that come on. I send a thank you letter to my Patreon members. So to have letter writing so central in this book was really nice for me as an avid letter writer.
Can I ask how much of it is about your love of stationery as well as your love of writing letters?
It's about a 60-40. It's about a 60-40 stationery.
Because I still write if somebody invites me over for, dinner or a party or whatever. I'm very old fashioned in that way. And I still write a thank you note to say, thank you so much for inviting me and all that. And the number of people who message me back and say, that is so lovely. Nobody does that. And I just, I love getting things in the post. I love mail. I love letters. And I love all the stuff that comes along with it. The good pen and the good stationery and all the kindred spirits here.
Yes. The occasional sticker that you put on there just, for funsies, themed, like cherry blossom season is coming here in Japan. So I definitely went out and bought some cherry blossom themed stationery. I love it. And I think more people need to write letters.
I agree.
And this is Julia and I's plea for more people to write letters.
Exactly. Get on board with this.
So important. So to continue on with the book, coming back from our stationery conversation. So I would love to know, I'm sure you have done so much historical research and just going through the archives to find information for this book. And there's so many little Easter eggs. Like at the very beginning of the book, you talk about how Sylvia loves to read and she goes to the library all the time and she brushed shoulders with a very famous author. Who wrote, Yes. A Handful of Dust, I believe is the book. And I was like, is Julia writing about a real book? Is this a real thing? I didn't know it was a real book. And it was a real author and a real book set in that time period. It would have been a very popular book. And you have a lot of little Easter eggs like that all throughout the Dressmakers of London. And I would love to know if there's any historical detail or moment that you found in your research that you weren't able to include in the book or something that had to get cut or something like that.
Well, there's a really big one. So the Evelyn Waugh, and so she runs into him at the London Library. It's a members library, which is you basically pay a subscription and you get access to the library. So it's a private library run through its members. And I actually work there. I use it and I use, because I don't have a research institution like a university behind me, it means that I can get access to a lot of, scholarly articles, books. It's just wonderful. And it's just, so it's my little nod to the London Library, putting it in there. And Evelyn Waugh was actually a member as well. So, obviously very, very long time ago. Yeah. But anyway, so that was just fun for me in general. There was an entire side of this book that never ended up being, because it's funny, we were talking about letters, and it is because of the letters that it didn't end up working. So initially, I have Izzy go to Norfolk, which is a beautiful, lovely, some people would say remote part of the UK, because it's not as easy to get there in terms of motorways and trains and things like that. I'm sure people from Norfolk would take exception to that. But, I initially actually was sending Izzy to Alexandria in Egypt. And I thought, I had read all of this stuff. I had these wonderful accounts of, a woman who was in the WAF, the auxiliary that Izzy is in. And I was like, this is great. I've got the research right at my fingertips. And I got to the point in this woman's diary where she said, and then we were sent to North Africa and it took months to get there. And I thought, months, okay, that's a problem. So what's going on here? And I realized that what happened was during the initial wave of WAFs that were sent to North Africa, sort of 1942, it was too dangerous to cross the Mediterranean either by ship or by plane to send troops. So they would have to go all the way down around Africa and then back up again. And it took months. And that, of course, meant the post was going to take months as well. And so I couldn't have Izzy writes a letter, sends it. 3 months later, 4 months later, Sylvia gets the letter, reads it, writes a response. 4 months later, Izzy gets the letter. And so I looked into, was airmail useful, and it was, but it was really expensive. And I just realized that unfortunately all this really interesting, wonderful research I'd done about, barrage balloon units in Alexandria, oh, by the way, so, the war in North Africa is fascinating, and it is something I definitely would like to write about at some point. For a lot of different reasons. But unfortunately, this was going to be one of those instances where I sent an email to my editor and I said, so, little change of plans. Sorry.
About Egypt.
About Egypt. I know we were really excited about Egypt. I know we were really excited about going in a different direction with, than some of the stuff I've written. How do you feel about Norfolk? I feel good if there's reason, but what is
happening? Norfolk, Egypt, what's going on here?
And that happens sometimes where, you can research and research and research, and you think you have everything at your fingers, and you've got a really good grasp on everything. But I tend to continue to read as I write. And, of course, things pop up and questions. And I was reading and going through sort of the practicalities of what's the timeline of this book as I'm writing it. It's unfolding and these relationships between these sisters. And I got to the part where Izzy is going to go off to, I think I even wrote a few pages of it, where Izzy is going off to North Africa. And I got to the part in the resource I was reading, and I thought, oh no. I made a horrible mistake. It goes to show that books are, as you write them, they're constantly evolving, and it doesn't matter how good your research is. Sometimes you run into something, maybe not as major as that, but sometimes you run into something that just changes what the story has to be. Because when you're writing historical fiction, you're making some choices about how historically accurate do I want to be. Yeah. But in that case, that was a big enough, I think I need to address the fact that I don't think this would have physically been possible at this time. So
we can suspend belief for some things, but sending a letter in a week between London and Alexandria, maybe that's a shade too far.
Yes, exactly. So, you sometimes you admit that you didn't quite get something right and move on from there.
That's okay. I think Norfolk is a fabulous place for this book to happen, and it was still incredibly wonderful to read, and I absolutely loved it. Like my listeners know, World War II is not, I keep saying this, that World War II is not something that I'm interested, but I keep having World War II people on the podcast and reading World War II things and talking about more World War II topics. But I mean, it does make sense because it is, one of the most documented historical events in the world. But I think it really, is a testament to your writing that you could make me interested in World War II. So thank you so much for that.
I think it's so interesting that you say, and I have gotten readers saying, it's really not something I'm interested in, but, and I think that's what's so interesting about it. I think when I first started writing about it, I was more in I know the battles, I know the general history, but it's not really, military history is not really my thing. And so I wasn't so drawn into that. And I don't think I've ever written a battle in a book. I've written an air raid, but I've never actually written a battle because it's not where my interest lies. And it's not where the stories that I want to tell really are focused. And so I think one of the things that's interesting about history is it can be such a number of things, and you can really focus on all sorts of different aspects. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, I thought for a period of time that I was going to go on and get my PhD in history. And I was really interested in the Victorian era and Victorian women's history. And so I sort of was not ignoring, but I had it for context, but I wasn't focusing on a lot of aspects of Victorian history because I was interested in what was going on with women and sort of women on the fringes of acceptable society. So, governesses, doctors, sex workers, people who were living lives that were not the conventional sort of what we think of as a Victorian woman. And so there's so much there that isn't, unfortunately, the way that sometimes history can be taught in school, when you're younger, it's a list of dates and significant, battles and major events. And that's important, but it's not the human side that I think a lot of people really are drawn to, because really history is story, right? It's stories that we tell about ourselves and our past. And I think that's where, if you lock into a topic that, you're interested in, and you have an author who's very nerdy about that topic, really excited about it, it can be wonderful. It can be so, so interesting no matter what era it is.
Yeah, yeah. And I think books like yours are a testament to why we need other perspectives in history, even if we think that a topic has been covered to death, like World War II, there's always something that hasn't been covered, that hasn't been talked about. And it's so important to have books like yours. And I love, the aspect of historical fiction, because we can humanize it a little bit more. And I think historical fiction is a great way to learn real history.
Absolutely.
I love historical fiction, and I will die on that hill. It's an important
same.
tool to learn history.
I agree. If you can make people interested, it can be such a gateway. It's one of the reasons I became interested in history when I was younger. I was reading a lot of historical fiction, and I think it's a really valid, great way of getting people interested. Again, outside of the sort of textbook approach of, teaching history.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Julia, thank you so much. I have one final question for you before we end our interview today. I would love to know if there is anything that you would like readers to take away from your book. Is there a message you would like your readers to take away from this book?
I think the message that I always hope, no matter what novel of mine people read, is that, there's a lot that we still have to learn and consider about women's role in history.
Yeah.
Again, it can get a bit lost among all of the, famous men who are, out there and doing things. And those are important, but there is a whole other side of history that has been underserved and under-discussed. And I think people are genuinely making an effort to try to reveal more about women in history. And I think that's wonderful. And I think there's so much more to go, and talk about, especially when it comes to, women of color, marginalized groups, stories that aren't necessarily the kind of, quote, mainstream of history. And so I hope that authors continue to, reach out and write and uncover these different things. I'm amazed that in an area like World War II that's very heavily documented, we still have stories I've never heard of coming out in the form of historical fiction. And I think that's wonderful. And my hope is also that readers are, excited and curious and want to learn more through reading those books.
Yeah, I agree. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Is there, hold on, let me restart that one. I would love for you to tell my delicious donuts, this is what I call my listeners, where they can find you, what, your handles, your social medias, anything that you're working on. The floor is yours to plug anything that you would like.
Amazing. Well, the easiest place is probably my website, which is juliakellywrites.com. And on there's a newsletter sign up link, which will take you straight to my Substack, which is also juliakellywrites.substack.com. I am a regular newsletter sender. I have actually, as we record this Friday, I'm starting a series about sort of the research that I did for the ration. So if you're interested in clothing rationing or historical fashion or any of that, it's going to be my nerdy little deep dive into clothing rationing with some old archive videos and sort of all the informational stuff that they put out, some very dated approaches to videos and video editing, but it's fascinating. And so I do, keep people updated on book news, but also I've been doing more and more sort of writing about some of the stuff that I find through research and, sharing book recommendations, things like that. I'm on the usual suspects. So Facebook and Instagram, I'm Julia Kelly Writes, and I'm also on TikTok as well with moderate success. So I've been doing more and more, but there's a lot of writing books as well as social media in my life at the moment.
Yes, and all of that information, all of the links to all of Julia's things will be in the show notes. So please check that out. Go pick up her book, request it for your library, get it on the Libby app. Anywhere that you get books, get this one. So thank you so much, Julia, for coming on. It was wonderful to talk to you. you. And I just appreciate you spending some time with us today.
Wow, thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Oh, yay. I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. So I will see you in the outro, dear one. Bye. Julia was an absolute gem. We had so much fun talking and going on so many side tangents. Just a little behind the scenes, for 30 more minutes after we stopped recording, we talked about our obsession with stationery. And I feel seen after talking to Julia about that, because I have a stationery obsession. And if you have a stationery obsession too, sound off in the comments, all right? Because I don't want to feel alone in my never-ending quest to find perfect stationery. But anyways, addictions aside, thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a rating, a review, a like, or a comment if you are over on YouTube. Ratings and reviews help so much, and comments and likes and shares are the best free 99 way to support the podcast and enable me to keep making these episodes, keep growing For the Love of History podcast, and keep bringing you world history, women's history, and weird history. If you're not quite sure what to write in a rating or a review, you can let me know what you're doing when you listen to these episodes, or you can let me know what your favorite part of For the Love of History podcast is. If you're over on YouTube and you're watching it there, let me know how you would spend your ration cards during World War II. Would you be buying dresses? Would you be buying socks? Me and the unpaid intern were talking about this, and we would definitely be buying undies, because I feel like that's important. Underwear is a staple for me personally. Okay, before I get any weirder, let me sign off. Please make sure you do something kind for yourself. Do something that makes you happy. Go outside, tempt some grass. Drink some water. I've got mine here. Take a little sippy sip. And I will see you next week for another author interview, because we are still on our break. It's almost over, I promise. Alrighty, I'll see you later. Love you. Bye.